Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. John Turner, former Prime Minister of Canada, passed away a couple of weeks ago, and a friend of mine, Marc Kealey, who runs a government relations consulting company, Kealey and Associates, was a long-term advisor and very close personal friend with the former Prime Minister. And so I thought I'd reach out to him and ask him for some recollections about Mr. Turner. Marc, how are you? Welcome to our show.
Ryan, thanks for having me. It's good to see you, and I really appreciate you doing this.
Tell me, how did you come to meet Prime Minister John Turner?
You know, I've been, I don't know how many times I've told this story, but we met in February of 1984. My aunt, who was a very well-known judge, a very close friend of Mr. Turner's, called me to tell me that Pierre Trudeau had taken his walk in the snow and that Turner was going to seek the leadership of the Liberal Party and that I should be on his campaign. And I got on the bus, Brian, and I never left.
And so started right with the leadership campaign. And
yes.
Did you work in his office as well?
I did. So I was with him when he was Prime Minister and throughout those years when he was Leader of the Opposition. You know, those were really interesting times too, Brian. You know, I don't think anybody, and you were around then too, I don't think anybody thought that the Liberal Party was going to win in 1984. I mean, the party had been just so decimated in terms of public support. And I just think people had had enough of the Liberal Party at 1984. So Turner kind of gave himself a bit of a mulligan, thinking, I know this is going to be a tough go for me. I'm going to do this election and I'm going to rebuild the party, which he did. It took 6 years to do it. And in my opinion, I think he laid the groundwork for Chrétien to become Prime Minister for 3 successive majorities.
And he went from, what was it? You'll remember the exact numbers, but 40-something seats in 84 to almost twice as much in 88, wasn't it?
Right. So if you recall, we almost, I think we got 42 seats in 84 and then got 88 seats in 88. So we doubled the number of seats, but that wasn't really the outcome that I think a lot of people should understand. I mean, the challenge that Turner had in 88 was obviously the fact that there was a huge issue with Meech Lake. There was an even bigger issue with the free trade agreement between Canada and the United States. And that was a polemic, I think, that created the kind of dialogue that made the 1988 election be one of the best that Canada had ever seen. But the bigger, more, I'm going to say the bigger issue was that it was that debate in 1988 that really turned the fortunes, not only for Mr. Turner, but for the Liberal Party and really bolstered their fortunes into that election. The Liberals almost won, Brian, in 88.
Some people think if the election campaign had gone on a little bit longer, that the Liberals might have won, that the polls were turning toward the Liberals, particularly after John Turner's very strong performance in the leadership debate. Is that not correct?
That's totally correct. And I would even argue too that, you know, the fact that that time and frankly, the ability to do massive amounts of fundraising for the particular government of the day really bolstered the fortunes of the free trade movement to get, I think the opposition at that time, Brian, did a spectacular job of painting Turner as an anti-free trader, which was not accurate. What he kept saying in that entire election in 1988 was, I've read this deal. I understand it. It's a bad deal for Canada, but I'm a free trader.
How do you think the Prime Minister will be remembered?
I think a number of ways. He's going to be remembered as probably the best statesman that this country has ever produced. I think everywhere we went all over the world, and he and I traveled all over the world together, I think people really knew that Turner had a real august role to play as a Canadian. Number one, he knew he was public property. He acted as if he was public property. And so I think people are going to remember him as a real statesman. And I think this is an important distinction to be made. I think media really paint him as a prime minister for only 79 days, little realizing just how much he had done since 1962 when he was elected those years from 62 to 75. And then in 84 to 92, I think he laid the groundwork, as I said earlier on, Brian, for the Liberal Party to become government for all of those years.
We're chatting tonight with Marc Kealey, the head of Kealey and Associates, a government relations firms, about his friend, the former Prime Minister John Turner, May he rest in peace, and some recollections about John Turner. Stay with us. We're going to come back more with Marc just after a few messages. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting with a friend of mine, Marc Kealey, who runs a government relations company, Kealey and Associates. He worked for numerous years for John Turner, the former Prime Minister of Canada, who passed away recently. But more importantly, I think than that, became a very close friend with the former Prime Minister. And I can't tell you how many different dinners and lunches and conventions and other things that I went to that, Marc, you would be there beside Mr. Turner, former Prime Minister, bringing him in. And that long-term association you had with him, that long-term friendship was obviously very special for both of you.
It was. And I wrote, I was asked to write something for a media outlet. And I just thought, what could I say? And, Brian, we talked on the phone every single day for 36 years. But more importantly, every Thursday we had lunch. Whether it was just to talk about, what he felt things were like, not only politically, but in his life and in the environment. But, I just thought that was something really, really special. And I will cherish those conversations for the rest of my life. He was an extraordinary man, that's for sure.
I spoke with Conrad Black about John Turner, and he said he was one of the best connectors, networkers, people that he had ever met, and that he did it in an incredibly authentic, personal, empathetic way. Is that your recollection?
Well, and I think, it's a lot of it is it's folklore now, but look, we've traveled to every corner of this country together over the last 36 years. And I can tell you that there were people that he would remember that he hadn't seen in years, that he would call them by their first name, or he would say, if there was an opportunity to have a discussion with so-and-so, he could link that discussion to something that was actually going on, or where we could move on to another issue. So he was, when you talk about being a connector, he knew how to connect, and he knew a lot of people in this country, which was remarkable. And, I just remember being on the street in Vancouver with him, and he saw a cab driver that had taken him in a cab 3 or 4 years earlier, and just mentioning his name. Those are the kinds of things that made this guy extraordinarily special. But this had been going on forever, Brian. He was really, a connector is a good way to describe this guy, for sure.
I understand that when he was Minister of, I'm not sure what the department was called, but Indian and Northern Affairs, he traveled right across the North and visited almost every community in the North. Is that correct?
Totally. And the other thing, too, that a lot of people don't know about John Turner is he was a prolific paddler. If you look at his coat of arms, his blazon, it's 4 canoes and 4 paddles. And he just, every inland waterway in this country, Turner had paddled. So I don't think there's a person in this country that could lay claim to that kind of a deal. But you're right, when he was Minister of Consumer and Corporate Affairs, he did a lot of work in small communities across Canada to make sure that people knew that they had a good champion or an advocate for what they wanted. And those are in the 60s. He's the architect of consumer protection. And I think that people need to really pay attention. I think I say this a lot too, Brian. We shouldn't necessarily read Wikipedia. I think there are a lot of history books about what this guy has done. And that's the legacy that Turner leaves in Canada.
He was also Justice Minister during the October crisis, which must have been quite an interesting time period. And I think a lot of people thought that he took a very unfair sort of criticism for some of the federal government's actions during the October crisis. What did he ever mention to you about that?
Well, we've had lots of discussions on that. I can tell you that and this is, the 3 big issues I think that he had to contend with when he was Minister of Justice is he dealt with the issue on abortion, and he dealt with that in the 60s. But when Pearson had resigned and Trudeau had taken over, he gave him the portfolio and said, "You fix this," and he did. He was the guy too, and we celebrated that at a dinner in Toronto a couple of years ago on the 40th anniversary of what Turner had done for same-sex rights. And I think even back in the 60s, that was a very big issue. And he was courageous about making sure that happened as something that gave the opportunity for rights for people from that perspective. And last, and I think this is a really important point, the October crisis in 1971 was a big, big issue in Canada. as you rightly pointed out, he was the minister that oversaw the implementation of the War Measures Act. And what he had said at the time to the prime minister was, I don't know if I really support you fundamentally taking over for as long as you want the rights of Canadians under the War Measures Act. So he actually convinced the Prime Minister Trudeau at the time, Brian, to only have it a shortened period of time. And that was the way that Turner and a lot of his colleagues in the House of Commons supported the War Measures Act.
He was also finance minister, but left, quit, I guess, over some disagreement with the prime minister. But, unlike Paul Martin, who similarly had a disagreement with his prime minister, Jean Chrétien, at the time, he did it in a very quiet manner and went, to Toronto and started a job on Bay Street as a corporate lawyer.
Yes.
Why did he quit? And was that the right decision? And do you think he handled it right?
Let me answer your question this way. About in 2012, Turner and I went to the Canadian Media Hall of Fame Awards. And at the time, three well-known Canadian journalists were getting awards. It was Peter Mansbridge, Peter Kent, and Lloyd Robertson. And when Robertson and Mansbridge went up to the microphone to accept their awards, both of them had talked about the most pivotal moment in their lives as reporters, and that was when Turner resigned in 1975. And the reason he did, they said, was because he showed tremendous ethics at a time when ethics were really being thrown out the window. So let me go back to 75. At the time, and if you probably remember this too, because you're as much of an animal in politics as anybody, Stanfield, who was the leader of the Conservatives at the time, had suggested that he was going to put in wage and price controls. And the Liberals fought against that. And people said, yeah, I don't want wage and price controls. And the Liberals won. They won their majority. And Turner was renamed as Minister of Finance. And what does the Prime Minister do? He decides to bring in wage and price controls shortly afterwards. And Turner had said, look, we fought against this. We had a social contract with Canadians to make sure that we won this election fair and square on opposing wage and price controls. And here you are now putting them in place. I can't support you. So quietly, he said, I'm going to do the right thing for me. I'm going to do the right thing for my conscience. And he left. And I thought that was a very pivotal moment in Canada, but it said a lot about John Turner as a human being, as somebody who's, for all intents and purposes, ethics meant more to him than following the political doctrine.
Do you think it's right, the description that he did that the right way and didn't sort of destroy his former boss, unlike Paul Martin, who seemingly left politics and worked hard to harm his former boss?
Well, I think you're right. And Turner always had this line where he said, I believe in three things: family, loyalty, and silence. And certainly, family,
loyalty, and silence.
That's Turner's mantra. It was a great mantra. And so he thought, look, I've got to show fealty to my leader, so I'm not going to go crazy on him in public, but he knows what I feel. And silence. I'm not going to say anything about this. And he really didn't, which was great. He took his time. And as you know, too, in 79, when Clark won and Trudeau left the first time, Turner wanted to come back. And he had sort of put himself in a position to say, maybe I'll test this. And it really didn't fit his life at the time. And so he waited for 84 when Trudeau decided to take his walk in the snow.
Now, during that whole time period from 67 or 68, when was the leadership? Don't even remember now. 67, I guess. 68. Until 84, the people that were with him on the final ballot in that leadership stuck with him.
Yes. They called them the Club 185. There were 185 of them on the last ballot. And he stayed on for 4 ballots in 68. Never should have, I'll be honest with you, Brian. But those people were, and there are some wonderful people that were in that group: David Smith, Erwin Kotler, Lloyd Axworthy. Those are big names in Canadian politics that stuck around with John Turner. He didn't command loyalty; he attracted it, and that was, I think, the difference between Turner and a lot of people in politics.
And did those people really stick with him for the subsequent 20 years?
Oh yeah, for sure. You could, Erwin Kotler and I did several media shows where he was an assistant to Turner in '68. So was Lloyd Axworthy, and David Smith and Turner used to, they would talk to each other on a weekly basis, even up until David Smith died. Very, very close friends.
How do you think he did after politics? He got involved in a bunch of different things, I understand.
He was, Brian. I mean, it was very the transition for him to get back into private life after his second incarnation in politics was not as easy. It was from 70 to 84. I can tell you very candidly that there were a lot of people that thought Turner's position against free trade, which was wrong. What he did, he wasn't against free trade. He was against that deal. And he proved over those subsequent years that he was right. He kept saying, "I'm going to be a prophet on this," and it was so right, because he was the guy that in private practice of law from '93 until he came to work with me in 2010 was he had suggested that 70 or 80 cases to the World Trade Organization had been fought against the United States on free trade. So he was very, very. I'm going to say he looked to be a lot more of a prophet than a lot of people give him credit for on things like free trade. But the whole issue on that and easing into private life at the outset was difficult, but it certainly proved to be extraordinarily great for him. He became a roving ambassador for Canadian democracy and parliamentary reform, parliamentary democracy. He hated the use of the word backbencher, Brian, and tried to make sure that not only Prime Minister Chrétien, but Trudeau, Harper, and even Martin, when he was Prime Minister, made sure that Turner believed that the role of the Member of Parliament was a heck of a lot more supreme than the role of the Prime Minister.
And he got involved in water in Ukraine, I understand?
Well, Ukraine was a big deal for Turner. I'd say that most people in this country who are of Ukrainian extraction and heritage know that John Turner is a hero. And he's a hero because what had happened was he had, if you recall, when Ukraine was making the transition between what it was as part of Russia to a democracy in the early 2000s, the president at the time was a guy by the name of Yanukovych, and one of his contenders was a guy by the name of Yushchenko, who became the president after democracy was put into Ukraine. And if you recall, Yushchenko, who was the president, was poisoned by the Russians. So that was no secret. So Turner had become a staunch advocate for democracy in Ukraine. And when the first election had happened in 2003, and it was a runoff that had to take place, Turner spoke on a rainy night in Toronto to 100,000 Ukrainians to talk about the fact that we need to bandy together as diaspora and make sure that our voices are heard as Canadian Ukrainians, to make sure that people in Ukraine voted and supported democracy. And then, if you recall, too, shortly afterwards, the Prime Minister at the time, Paul Martin, had suggested to Turner, "Why don't you lead a delegation?" It was the largest delegation of people to go to Ukraine to observe that mission of anywhere on planet Earth. And there were 1,500 Canadians that Turner led to Ukraine. And Brian, it was extraordinary. Just the effort that he extended himself to do in Ukraine to make sure that not only did he help the Ukrainian Electoral Commission, but he met with both of the presidential contenders to talk to them about how they act during this time. And he motivated people to get out and vote. It was extraordinary. For me, because I was there with him the entire time, that was Christmas between 2003 and 2004. And if you recall, there was in Revolution Square about 1 million people, and Turner spoke to them on the stage that night, which was probably for me one of the most overwhelming things I've ever seen.
What a great opportunity for you to be with him during those types of experiences.
Oh, it was extraordinary. And just to watch him, he really does. He loves, he just loves, because he always makes this comment, people govern people, he keeps thinking. And so politics was all about anthropology to him. And just to watch him move in anthropological circumstances just really puts him on a different plateau than most normal people.
So you're, in addition to being a good friend and former employee and partner of Prime Minister John Turner's, you're a student of politics, a political junkie. And, it's interesting as we go through leadership debates in BC and the United States and other things. The two times that I remember John Turner the most are two different leadership debates. One in I guess, 82.
84.
84. When he was on the receiving end of an incredibly good comment by Brian Mulroney that I think stuck with him. And then in 88, when he delivered a almost, not a knockout blow, but an incredible blow to the Prime Minister Mulroney about free trade at the time.
Yes.
It is interesting that, people say leadership debates don't count, but those two debates stick out in my mind. Do they stick out in your mind?
Well, I think, yes, they do. And, there was a collective gasp in 84. We can all look back in hindsight to say, here's what he should have said. But as I said earlier on, Brian, I think there was almost resignation in 84. We knew that people didn't like the Liberal Party. It wasn't John Turner. And of course, he certainly didn't help. He was rusty. He had that stutter, the bum padding incident with Iona Campagnola, that didn't help. So there were a number of things that I think, and he didn't really have a long time between him becoming the leader of the party and prime minister in June, and when we had the election in September. So I think in hindsight, a lot of people said he should have held on. But if you remember too, as both of us are students of this, that even the dialogue in the House of Commons was, call the election. We're tired. We want to refresh Parliament. And you owe an obligation as the incoming leader of the party and the incoming prime minister to fix this sort of malaise that's going on. So there was a lot of pressure on him to call that. So yeah, you're right. That Mulroney was stellar in 84. And if I was in Turner's position, I'd say, what have you done? I mean, you're the leader of an opposition where you've done nothing. You've had minimal experience in your role, and you want to assume the mantle. I mean, the Liberal Party up to that point had been a very good government from 80 to 84, and I don't think that was really given the opportunity to sort of weigh itself out against the opposition. Juxtapose that against 88, Brian, I think, you're right. Turner had become a hardened political campaigner. Not only did he face off against 1984, we had the leadership review in 1986, we had Meech Lake, you had free trade, you had a number of issues going up to 1988. He was grizzled. He was battle ready. And I think that he certainly proved that in 88. We came into that election really, really well prepared. There was some really good policy. And then you're right, that debate, I think if people ever had an opportunity to watch really good debating, there were three people on that stage. And it was almost as if, who the heck was Ed Brabant? He got limited airtime. But Turner and Mulroney, it was knock him down, drag him out, and very, very effective debating. I'll say this, Brian, one of the things that Turner always talks about, and I think I inferred that from your comments at the outset about what's happening in the elections that are going on in this country right now and in the United States, is that in politics now, and Turner always made this point very clear, that today it's almost as if they're enemies. And he thinks we don't need to have enemies in politics. We should have opponents, and we should debate appropriately. But at the end of the day, to have an enemy really disintegrates or degenerates the dialogue.
I mentioned I spoke to Conrad Black, and he's obviously of a very different political persuasion, but knew John Turner very well. His comment was that John Turner was the best prime minister Canada never had, or sort of almost had, for only, 79 days or something like that. Do you agree?
Yes, I think a lot of people would say life would have been different had he stayed on as prime minister for a lot longer. Here's a guy who has relationships internationally that a lot of people in Canada certainly would have benefited from and by. Some of his best friends are well-placed political types in the United States. He's good friends with the Bush family. He was great friends with the Kennedys. George Shultz is one of his good friends. The former presidents of France, couple were good friends of his. Same with Italy and Australia. He had those kinds of international friendships even up until he died. So yeah, I think he had a gravitas that I think put him on a plateau that would have done things a lot better, I think, or a lot differently than what we've seen over the last 35, 40 years.
Marc Kealey and Associates, thank you very much for joining us and telling us about your recollections of the former Prime Minister, John Turner. Really appreciate it.
I really appreciate the opportunity. See you soon.
Come back again and chat with us another time.
Love to. Thanks, Brian.
Stay with us. We're going to come back in just a minute. Stay with us.